The Blocktalk Podcast started because of my passion for the property management industry. I wanted to start a conversation and add some value within the industry with a diverse range of people and professionals who can add something extra. As we start out, my aim is that the podcast offers some useful insight into a variety of views, opinions, thoughts, and foresights from our guests, who include business leaders and industry experts. If you enjoy the podcast and want to find out any other information, head on over to brianwelsh.co.uk. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Blocktalk Podcast with me, Brian Welsh. Today we're delighted to be joined by Neil Watt, Chairman of Hacking and Paterson. We've had a failed attempt to have Neil in once before. I think that was because of tech difficulties this end. Neil joined Hacking and Paterson in 1982, was appointed to the board 4 years later in 1986, and subsequently became Managing Director in 2008. Going on to be appointed as chairman in August 2019. This intro is going to take a while, by the way. Neil is a former director and president of the PMAS, has served as the director of the British Property Federation, and continues to be actively involved in providing guidance and input to Scottish Government and other regulatory bodies on the requirements for continued and improved maintenance of the country's housing stock. Wow, I got through it. Okay, Neil, thanks for coming in. Nice to see you. How are you?
Good morning, Brian. Thanks for the invitation. It's been a while. And yes, we did have a failed attempt, but delighted to finally make it. And it's an honour to be sitting here, Brian, in front of the factoring industry software kingpin. So maybe one day in the future, the tables will be turned and I'll be interviewing you, Brian. But delighted to be good.
That would be good. Good. I'm glad you came along. Okay, so first thing we need to talk about. Earlier in the year at the Property Managers Association dinner, you were awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award. Congratulations on that. That must have been an amazing achievement. So how does it feel to get that and to receive that? But also, how has your leadership management style evolved over the years and why?
Well, it was generally an honour to be recognised by your peers and by the industry. And the industry I've been in for a long time. Doesn't seem like 40 years plus since I first walked up the steps of 1 Newton Terrace. Wow. And was interviewed by Mr. Anderson, who at that stage appeared to me as if he should be in retirement. He was probably younger than I am just now, but anyway, in those days they seemed to look a bit older than hopefully I do now. And I remember being led up the staircase into his office, and Mr. Anderson sat behind a big oak desk, and he had two things on it. He had a telephone and he had a black leather-bound Bible. And we sat for half an hour and discussed everything except the property industry. We discussed about sport, we discussed family, we discussed religion. And at the end of that half hour, he said, "Yes, I think we could do with you. I think we'll take you on." And genuinely had not discussed the job, had discussed the role. But interestingly, I took something from that because he clearly was interviewing the person, the individual, as opposed to what talents he might have or what attributes he might have to be able to bring to the company. He did introduce me to somebody later on who knew a little bit about the industry and what factoring was about. So that was my introduction to it a long time ago. As I say, it doesn't seem like all these 42 years ago since then, and to be recognised by the industry for whatever I have achieved over that period of time was very, very humbling. And you'd asked about leadership style and management. I think you adapt to the circumstances, Brian. I think ultimately you stick to who you are. You stick to your core. You stick to your ethos and your principles of who you are and what you think business should be about and how to lead. My way of managing and leading the business in particular is to be conscientious, is to listen to others, is to take account of their feelings, and also to listen to other people's ideas. Don't think for a minute that you know it all yourself. You don't. You bounce off other people and they help you adapt your ideas and your focus. And generally creating an environment where people feel supported and feel valued. listen to people. So I would say, in summary, be conscientious of your people, of your employees, of everybody around about you. Listen to them, but ultimately be bold. Be bold in making decisions. There's no point in being conscientious and helpful and pandering to people without being firm and being bold. So, and obviously at the end of all that, you can make harsh decisions with a smile on your face, as long as you can convince yourself that you've taken everybody along with you. Has it changed over the years, to come to your other point? Not really, because as I say, you are who you are. You develop your own style. I think over the years, I have, in looking at others and listening to others, probably taken on board more of things I wouldn't do rather than I would do.
Yeah.
I think there's something in that, in looking at situations and looking at leaders and how they respond. And if that just doesn't fit with your persona, it doesn't fit with your values, then that's one to put to the side. So, over a long period of time, 40 years of managing and leading, I wouldn't say it's changed an awful lot. Yes, you pick up tips along the way. But I think when Mr. Anderson first interviewed me, I'd like to think I'm probably still the same person as I was all these years ago.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, you go along and you see what you don't like, and that probably affects you differently as well, to say, right, okay, I'm never, ever going to be like that. I have to say, there's books on here. I read an awful lot of business books. And one of the overriding things I got out of most of them was that, and you've mentioned it yourself, you cannot do everything. You cannot know everything. And actually, someone once used the phrase, I'm not a mad fan of it, but it's a phrase, make yourself the dumbest person in the room, because then, ideas will flow and things like that. Okay, you've got to make the decision of what to do. And I think that's a positive, because certainly in my career, my first two bosses were not like that at all. And then I just figured that was life, and then I walked into a business where it wasn't like that, and you were asked questions, you were asked for your opinion, and it mattered. And actually that environment is better for the team and everything.
I agree, Brian. And like you, I've read a whole host of these books, and you do sort of fold back the top corner to reference it in the future of the things that you think, no, that's just that's not me. That's not the way I want to handle it. And there's always something to be learned from these books. The one that I do enjoy reading and I subscribe to is the Harvard Business Review. There's always something in there that provokes a thought, provokes attention that you maybe hadn't considered. But like you, enjoy reading about others and what their styles are, and each to their own.
Your interview actually with Mr. Anderson reminds me of the first time that we met. Or maybe not the first time that we met, but I came in to meet you when we did the contract signing for the first, when we first took on CPL. And I think I was in your office for 3 hours. We spoke about the contract for about 15. And we spoke about a whole load of other stuff for the rest of the time. So I know what you mean. Okay, cool. So over 40 years in the industry, could you give us some history about the industry and how it has evolved over the years?
Oh boy, Brian, how long have you got? This could be a long answer. And it's more than my 42 years. You can back 150 years in the industry. It's probably fair to say it's split into 3 sections.
Okay.
The introduction of the house factor, as it was referred to when I started off, 150 years ago, post-industrial revolution, tenements being thrown up, more so in the west of Scotland, but also different styles of tenement buildings in the east coast and north. And these were tenement buildings, traditional sandstone tenement buildings built by landlords, built by shipping companies who were developing down the River Clyde, and they needed workers to come into the city. So they come from the outback, they came from the Highlands, and shipping companies and general entrepreneurs built not only individual tenements, but streets and streets of tenements.
Okay.
And that lasted for a long time. That probably takes account of the first almost the first 100 years of tenement life, where these tenements were constructed for the use of workers and who were tenants. there was a need there for an agent of, let's call it the shipping company, the landlord, to find tenants for them, to control the tenants and the rents, etc. So that's when the property factor, as we call them today, was born in the cities. She was a very well-respected individual, a powerful individual. This person held the keys to these flats, to these homes that families were desperate to get the keys of and start a new life in the cities. So he was a very important person, very powerful person. And that continued, as I say, for probably about the first 100 years. The second phase of tenements and factoring comes around post-Second World War, where government started to control rents. Don't think it's something new, Brian. This happened a long time ago. Rent Acts came out, and these landlords soon realised that this was no longer a viable proposition, looking after these tenement properties. They controlled the rents, the value of the rents. By this stage, tenements were needing substantial work done to them, and the landlords just couldn't or weren't willing to pay the cost or couldn't afford to pay it because of the controls on the rents. So that brought about a transition which leads you into the third phase, which became, as we called it, owner occupation. Yeah. So instead of a traditional tenement of 8 or 10 or 12 flats with individual tenants paying a rent through the factor to the landlord, that then developed into the first break-off from that situation where the first flat was sold into owner occupation because the landlord wanted to move out of that sector. And because it was so tightly controlled, it took a long, long time for that process to evolve to a point where it flipped completely from having a building full of tenants paying a rent to a landlord through a factor to a building full of owner-occupiers or homeowners, as the legislation now calls them. And interestingly, the factor is the one constant through that because the tenure changed. The buildings didn't change, but the factor changed his guise. He came from being the landlord's agent collecting rents and where necessary doing the difficult things of rent arrears, etc., rent controls, to being an agent for a group of people, a group of transient people coming and going as owners of tenement property. And then that leads you into, beyond that transition, into what you have now. The tenement is defined as not just a traditional sandstone tenement, modern blocks of flats, 200, 300, 400 blocks of flats. And then the factor's role then is something different because as well as simply looking after the basic common parts of maintenance of a traditional sandstone tenement, is now looking after all sorts of facilities for co-owners. So that is kind of the evolution over a period of time. The factor has moved with the times, he's evolved with the times. One of my mentors once told me that the role of being a factor was a jack of all trades and master of none. And I didn't understand it at the time, but now that I see that we, as factors, have a finger in every pie, we've got to know a little bit about everything related to the property, whether that's financial, legal, construction, etc. I suppose our expertise as factors comes from being the agent and pulling that all together. So that's the kind of evolution of it. There's a couple of important, other than the Rent Acts of the 50s and 60s, a couple of important pieces of legislation that has helped that evolution. In terms of the 150-year time span of the life of a tenement, they're both fairly recent. 2004 was a Tenement Scotland Act, which helped define or redefine what were actually common parts in tenement property, because that had been lost in the midst of time through poor translation in title deeds when new titles were created for flats out of these old landlord situations. But the Tenements Act helped clarify that. It also brought along a management scheme, which could have worked, but lacked the compulsion. But there was a basic management scheme for factors to work to, called the Tenement Management Scheme. So that is part of the evolution. And the major part of evolution in recent times has been the Property Factors Act, and importantly the Code of Conduct, which has been, in my opinion, it's been a great thing for homeowners, and it's been a great thing for the factoring industry. It's pulled, I believe, it's pulled the industry and the service those in the industry provide together. It gives it a more focused and intentional way of working. And I think that probably is the biggest single piece of legislation that has benefited the industry and the homeowners. And of course, as a byproduct of that, it created, with the property factor register, it created a whole host of, some would say, new property factors. I would say, well, there were always property factors, and what I'm referring to is local authorities and housing associations. Through their legislation of right to buy, where tenants, by acquiring their rented property through a right to buy scheme, overnight became an owner-occupier, and probably didn't really understand the concept of it. Did the local authorities understand the concept of it? I'm not all that sure that they did. So they sort of fell into being a factor, but because they always retained, until recently, the majority ownership, they didn't really divest any responsibility or any decision-making or power-making over to those owners. But whether or not they, as a housing association or a local authority, continue to own the majority of units within a flat, with this legislation that appeared on the 1st of October 2012, overnight these people were declared as property factors. So the market has changed quite considerably. And there has been for 10 years now, beyond that, opportunities and openings for housing associations to expand their portfolio. And some have, some don't seem to be too interested in it. But that's another consequence of the evolution. Brian.
Okay, interesting. That was fascinating, the early bit. A lot of that I did not know. Yeah, so I'm glad you came up with that.
It takes somebody of my, I'll say, vintage, Brian, to be able to recall these stories, because if I don't pass these stories out through the generations, because the younger people in my organisation wouldn't know these. We do our best to try and recreate the history. And the firm had its centenary event a couple of years ago, and that gives an opportunity to rehearse all these historical events and historical stories. So I think it's important, and I had a visit from two of our property managers, where my door's always open to any staff if they can find me through the maze and Rabbit Warren that is our office, and they were both really interested in history and just trying to get something tangible rather than reading about it or hearing about it second or third hand. Being able to speak to somebody who was involved 30, 40 years ago, who at that time had access to people who were involved 30 or 40 years before that. And I can go back to somebody who I know knew Mr. Paterson of Hacking and Paterson. So it's nice that there's that flow that continues.
And when you talk to someone, in fact, this reminds me of a conversation we were having, maybe even with David actually recently, about AI. And we were talking about the fact that when you have a conversation with someone, stuff will come out from left field, and something will pop into someone's head. Someone said to me a couple of days ago that I digress too much and talk about other things when I should stay on topic. But I'm like, it's who I am. I'm not going to be able to change it. It's just who I am.
Yes, and the problem is when you digress, it's trying to get back to where you started from.
That becomes more difficult as one gets older. But we were talking about this kind of AI thing, and it was like, you ask AI a question, it'll give you an answer, right? You ask, I don't know, Neil Watt a question, and he'll give you an answer. But there'll be other things around that answer. Do you know what I mean? That try and kind of bring that out. So it's it's valuable. Yeah. So okay, excellent. Okay, next question for you. And actually moving on from what you've already spoken about, one of the changes that's happening now is the review of how tenements are managed, the responsibility of owners. As someone who is involved in the Scottish Parliament's Tenement Maintenance Working Group, do you have insights you can share about how that is moving forward?
Oh yes, lots of them, Brian.
You've been waiting for that question, obviously.
No, I've been hoping and waiting for this moment in time that is happening at the moment with forthcoming legislation for a long, long time. I was privileged to be invited onto something called the Housing Improvement Task Force. It goes back to 2000, which was a review of housing stock. Scottish Government review of housing stock. And one of the things that we mentioned earlier that came out of that piece of work was the Tenements Scotland Act. Also the Title Conditions Act 2003 came out of that. And there were some fairly strong and robust recommendations made by the factoring industry at that point. It included compulsory common insurance, which still hasn't received the necessary confidence of those making decisions to go through, but hopefully one day that will come to pass. But that piece of work made strong recommendations for owners' associations as formal bodies sadly, that didn't go through. However, where we are now, 20, 25 years on, is that the Scottish Government have instructed or had instructed the Scottish Law Commission to embark on a piece of work which ultimately will transform into a report and a bill and hopefully become an act in the fullness of time, which will be to the benefit of the country's housing stock immeasurably. And it's something that, in my opinion, was a missed opportunity all these years ago. It's a housing issue, although we're here today talking about factoring. The factoring side of it is a byproduct of this legislation, which hopefully is going to get through. The Tenement Maintenance Working Group, which you alluded to, again, I was privileged to be invited to be part of that. That has been a frustratingly slow process, but a pleasing process as to where it's got to at the moment, which is, as I mentioned, the Scottish Law Commission has been invited by the Scottish Government to consider the proposals put forward by the Maintenance Working Group, which is 3 strands. Rather disappointingly, they've picked up only in the first one, but their argument for that is if we can get the first one right, the other 2 will flow. So they've concentrated on compulsory owners associations.
Okay.
The 2 that flow beyond that will be building condition inspections, 5-year inspections, and building reserve funds. I had hoped that it will come together collectively, but that's the way that it is going at the moment. So where we are at the moment is that the Scottish Law Commission spent 2 years researching it, come up with a discussion paper, which went out for public consultation the early part of the year, with an enormous amount of very relevant questions. The result of that will be a final report by them and a draft bill, which they're suggesting will come out in 2026. And the principal purpose behind that bill will be to create an owners association for every tenement property, whether it's a tenement of 2 or 3 units or whether it's a tenement of 500 units, that there will be a legal obligation to have an owners association. We have owners associations, some of them formal, some informal, but this will be a requirement, a legislative requirement for every owner to form an association, and they'll have a period of time in which to do so. So we're interested to sit by and see what the Scottish Law Commission come up with. I'm very pleased that they seem to understand it. They seem to grasp what it's about. And as I mentioned earlier, the factoring side is a byproduct of this. This is not about factoring, although it's helpful that they're interested in having people from our industry that can relate the real life stories. It's all very well looking at the technicalities of it and the legalities of it, but the true life stories of how this could impact on people is important, and they've taken that on. So that is an exciting time, I think, in the factoring industry.
Okay. Actually, it reminded me of my niece is about to buy her first flat. And of course, every single time she finds one, my brother messages me and goes, how do I search the factors register again to find out who manages this? And she's seen a few, and she came up with one the other day, and it's cheap, of course. It's up in Dundee. It's cheap. The home report is not great, and it's self-factored. Okay, so I said to my brother, I said, she needs to ask, what does that mean and what is in there? And I think she's decided not to go for it because of the amount of problems the amount of kind of things on the home report that aren't great, and the fact that it's self-factored. Because whilst to a 23-year-old, not having a factors bill would be a great thing. She does understand that she needs to maintain it. And it's obviously not been maintained overly well. It's and I think that's the problem, because you've got, and we've spoken about this many, many, many times on this podcast, and it's the education piece about people actually understanding that they need to look after the property and stuff, and it tends to be downsizers and new people.
I've got a view on that, Brian, because I've heard throughout my entire career that there's a lack of education, there's a lack of training of owners, and we need to grasp this. And I disagree with that, because I think, short of a Scottish Government long-standing publicity campaign on TV, on billboards, which is not going to happen, that I think there's been an enormous amount of education and public information out there. You just need to tap into Scottish Government website. Every local authority will have the information. Every factoring organisation will have the information. The charity Under One Roof, who I'm not sure if they've been in your podcast or not, have got a fabulous website with a host of information about what it means to be an owner. So I keep hearing this, that there's an education needs to be put forward to the homeowning public. I think the question, does that homeowning public, you're referencing your daughter, are they really actually interested? Do they really want to?
It's apathy then that they don't. It's not something they're interested in or have to worry about. So therefore, they don't.
Yeah, and it's surprising, isn't it? Why, when you're probably your biggest single purchase, your biggest single asset, why would you be apathetic about the potential for it? Yeah. I mean, one thing that would discount probably about 60% of tenement flats that would be available if I was looking to purchase one like your daughter. I would never buy a property that was unfactored or self-factored. Not a criticism of self-factoring, because that can absolutely work, but I wouldn't want to run the risk. Mm-hmm. And I would never buy a top floor flat. Yeah. So that in itself discounts you. Now, there's something wrong with the system if somebody like me with the experience I have in the industry saying I wouldn't buy a top floor flat and I wouldn't buy one without a factor. I mean, that could change, obviously. You could have one with a factor, whether it's local authority or not. That could change overnight. But the interesting thing, going back to the hopefully the forthcoming legislation in 2026, an obligatory owners association, which will be a legal entity, they in turn have a duty to appoint what the legislation will call a manager. Yeah. Not to be confused with property manager or factor, a manager. That manager could be a factor, or it could be somebody within the building. It could be self-factored. That, to me, and I think we're going to go on and talk about that will bring something new to the market, to the factoring market. I think it's something huge that is out there that I don't think people quite realise at the moment, that's a big opportunity for people. So that's all got to be fleshed out. Who are these factors going to be? I read one of the responses to the discussion paper by an unnamed party who thought it would be a good idea to open up the opportunity of that manager to lawyers, to accountants, to estate agents. I struggle a bit with that. I'm all for new people coming into the industry, but to sort of throw it out and widen the net to anybody who wants to have a go at factoring, I think is not a good idea. But something I think that was covered with one of your previous speakers on your podcast is, with all these pieces of legislation, as always, the devil's in the detail, and in this particular case, it's all about enforcement. Yeah. And will it be enforced? And whoever that enforcer is, probably the local authority, do they have the will? Do they have the resource? Because that's where the whole thing could fall down. Yeah. But it's on the right lines, and the Scottish Law Commission, I think, have done well listening to all the different interested parties. So hopefully in 2026 we'll see the start of legislation coming in. I think it'll be a slow burn. I think because of one of the other two strands that I'd mentioned being reserve funds, and that being a legal imposition on owners, I think that's going to be a slow burn. I just can't see the politicians pushing straight ahead and having big sums of money that are necessary to be put into reserve funds. I think that might be built up over a period of time. So you might be 5, 10, 15 years before you get these funds built up to a sensible position. And I think as well, that apart from the impetus caused by people like Under One Roof, like the Property Managers Association, to get this legislation through, that there are others that recognise that this is necessary. I mean, I think every local council and MSP must by now have a bulging mailbag from occupiers with horror stories of whether it's about the factor or the neighbour or the council. And I think eventually there's been that groundswell of angst amongst all sorts of parties that have brought this to a head. Because it's quite unusual to have every party coming together and supporting this, particularly with election season in the past and to come. But all parties seem to be very keen to have this pushed through. But the proviso, of course, that it's not going to cost them too much money, and that's why I think this will take a while to build up.
Yeah, okay. I guess touching on a couple of things you've you've said then, what do you think are the biggest risks facing the industry then?
This strange industry has proved to be such a resilient industry. It's been through, well, we've talked about 150 years. It's been through generational changes. It's been through changes in government. It's been through recessions. It's been through wars. And it seems to come out the other side. I wouldn't say unscathed, but it seems to come out the other side with a recognition that this is an industry that is needed out there. Yes, it has its risks. As to the future, are there any new risks coming along? I think that's just general business risks, Brian. I don't think there's anything specifically relating to the subject of factoring. Bearing in mind, a factor is an agent. Yeah. He's just a front man for somebody, for a group of owners carrying out their instructions or their wishes. So as long as they retain their professionalism, the risks, I don't want to say there aren't any, because obviously there will be. There might be unforeseen risks. I think economic risks, but that's going to affect every business. Possible government intervention. We saw that with the Property Factors Act. I believe that has been a good thing for the industry. As long as a business you can respond to that and embrace it and be agile and move with it. Cash flow. Pretty obvious, isn't it, with any business? I think keeping on top of that, and in your line of work, keeping pace with technology and IT, I think is huge. I think probably that's the biggest risk at the moment that I would see is not keeping in touch with tech changes. And as we discussed before we started, the new workforce, the new regime of workforce, the new generation, who are going to be the leaders of the future. Yeah, I'm not saying that they'll get things right all the time, but it's a different mindset, and I think as business owners we need to take account of them. I think you should always be wary of what risks are around the corner, but we seem to have survived and fended off what challenges have been presented to us over the years.
Yeah, okay. So let's talk about what you think the biggest opportunities are then.
Opportunity. It depends what you mean by opportunities, but you could look at that a couple of ways. There's been a lot of activity in the factoring market in recent times in terms of acquisitions and sales and mergers.
Only a wee bit, especially the last 3 months.
Just a wee bit, just about 9 or 10 firms in the last couple of years. I'm not sure why there's been this flurry of activity, but that seems to be what's been happening. So if you're a business owner of a factoring firm and you're interested in moving on, getting out of the industry or passing it on to others, then that's an opportunity. Yeah. If that's the route that you want to go down, is that an issue for the industry? Well, it's certainly reducing the number of factoring firms out there. That might, the larger firms might think that's a good thing. Personally, I would rather see more firms. I'd rather see more smaller firms. But again, going back to what we talked about, local authorities and housing associations, you go to the Property Factor Register, you've got 400 factoring firms. But if you go back to the mainstream, what people would recognise as traditional private factoring firms, they are disappearing. So there's an opportunity for people who want to move out. For those that want to stay in it, I think it is a very exciting time to be in this industry, and again referencing the legislation. I think that in itself could bring about big opportunities, because I do think that when the legislation comes through and these homeowners associations have a legal obligation to appoint a manager, much as I would like to think that some of them could self-factor, I think you'll find that more often than not they won't be able to. Yeah. And that's just the ones that are currently self-factored. There's a whole raft of properties that have no factor whatsoever, more so out with the conurbations. Yeah. And they will have to have factors as well. So I think there's a big opportunity for factors to grow their business. Yeah. I also think with the changes coming up with 5-yearly inspections and reserve funds, there's extra work for factors there. There's extra opportunities to create something bespoke within their business to offer services to owners associations. Because I don't think these owners associations are going to be able to handle all themselves. I think when you look into the detail of the proposed legislation, where they've got to hold AGMs and they've got to have budgets, and that's just scratching at the surface. I think beyond that, there's more obligations, and with it comes liability. And if you're an owner in a block of flats, do you want to step forward and take on that responsibility on behalf of 100 neighbours or even 5 neighbours, and the potential legal implications, because you're becoming a legal entity, and you're going to have responsibility. At the moment, as a self-factor person, I don't think you've got too much responsibility. I think you can duck and dive your way out of that if something goes wrong. But I just think where it's a formal legal entity, that there's going to be an issue. So no, I think it's a good time to be in the industry, and I think there's good opportunities for those in it. I think there's also good opportunities for people to start in the industry, both in terms of joining an existing firm and working their way through the system, if that's what they choose to do, or for new firms emerging. I mean, it's been disappointing that there's been so few new firms have emerged in the last, let's say, 10 years. There's only been sort of 4 or 5. And what they seem to be doing is they seem to be entering the market with a view to getting out. Now, that's entrepreneurial, that's fine. It's not really what I've been used to in my lifetime in factoring, that you build something up and you'd have a robust business that you could spend a lifetime in and pass to other partners or family. But some of these entrepreneurial types are entering the space, building up a portfolio and selling it on. But to do it's a slow burn, as you know, Brian. It's a difficult thing to start a factors business. You need to build it on the back of something. So you might have a letting business, you might have an estate agency business, you might have some property that you have. If you've got a base and you have an infrastructure and some admin support, then you can build onto it. But to start with your first property and then try and build it up from there,
I mean, if you've got a couple in your back pocket, then, but otherwise, how are you funding that? So no, I agree with you. I think there's been a few. I mean, there's been a couple over the last kind of, I don't know, 5 to 10 years who have started with one, and then they're 10,000-20,000 units now. There's a few entrants, to be fair. There's a few smaller ones coming in just now, but you're right, they're built on the back of something else they do within the industry as well. I think we've been getting inquiries for years from people saying, "Oh, I own this business, I don't know, letting business, I'm going to move into factoring because I've got some disgruntled blah blah." But then actually, when they realise how difficult it is, they it doesn't move much further. So but no, it is. You're right. I mean, the market's consolidating massively. So I mean, I've worked in industry. I mean, software industries that have done that as well, where you've got 2 or 3 main consolidators who then buy up tons of small businesses and they make it one big business. Now, nothing against that, and that's fine. But there is a faction of the client base that bought into the guy who owned that business that's just been sold, who bought into this that's just been sold, and then if they're suddenly they had the MD's mobile number and they could phone him and go, "I've got a bit of a problem here." Suddenly they can't do that anymore, and it's like, oh. So there is different parts of that kind of base that might think differently.
And historically, the sort of traditional factoring firms, they were more geographical, Brian. My firm, for example, when I began, they had an office in Clydebank, they had an office in Helensburgh, they had an office in East End of Glasgow, they had an office in the city centre. Wow. And they serviced the local communities, pre-email and tech and the rest of it. And the staff would be out on the streets and collecting rent and seeing properties and seeing contractors at properties. And then as time moves by, that was consolidated into a larger office. And the geography of it was no longer, and it isn't important now. No. You can operate from anywhere, and I don't think any customers really of any factoring practice are all that bothered where their office is. It's more about getting the contractor out to do the job. But previously, factoring firms would reach an optimum size of, let's say, 5,000 units. And that was probably about the limit, because they worked in geographical areas, and that was all they could muster from that area. But with technology, it's enabled them to bring their base together and grow. And I suppose, like any business, that there's a point where you have a critical mass, and beyond which you haven't got the infrastructure to take it to the next level. Mm-hmm. So to go from 5,000 units to 10,000 units, or from 10,000 to 20, each step is quite a major and significant event in the business's life to make that jump. And it might cost them money, and they might be losing money for the first few years while they go from 5 to 10, and the infrastructure and the bigger office and more salaries and the rest. And maybe some people are quite happy, and why not, in a business of 5,000 units now, sort of lifestyle.
You're
business.
right. I was going to say that, for some people it is a lifestyle business. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You get to 2,500 units or 3,000 units in this industry, and you can make a decent living out of it. Yeah. So okay, interesting. Last question on the industry. Where do you see it in 2030? And every time I say 2030, I think, wow, that's miles away. But it's not. It's only 5
when I saw it, when I knew you were going to ask me that question, I thought, does he really mean 2030? I was like,
it's only 5 years away. Well, I'll be 60 in 2030, so I think I always think it's a long way away, but hey, it's 5 years. So let's talk about what we think it's 5 years.
Where would I see it? Where would I like it to be? Again, I keep harping on about this legislation, Brian, but I'd love to see in 2030 that every tenement has an owners association, it has a manager, it has an AGM, and it has a sensible budget to work towards, which then leads into the reserve fund, so that every tenement can be effectively maintained and looked after. Whether it's through a factor or not, it's a bit irrelevant. Yeah. At my stage in my career, it'd be nice to leave a legacy, but my legacy that I would rather leave is to make sure that the country's housing stock is being maintained in some shape or fashion. I think it can get there, but it is hugely reliant on this moment in time as to whether this piece of legislation goes through. Because if it doesn't go through, I don't know where you go from there. And our response, which some felt was a little bit cheeky to the Scottish Law Commission, which it wasn't, in my opinion, it wasn't cheeky. It was just, as you get older, you feel you can say what you like, Brian. But I said to the Law Commission, let's hope it's not, my concluding remarks were, let's hope it's not another 34 years before the Scottish Government visit this issue again, because it's 34 years since the last time that I talked about the Housing Improvement Task Force. And that's the sort of timescales that you're dealing with here. If this doesn't go through, it's going to be another generation that's going to miss. And all that's going to happen is that the great piece of work that Professor Douglas Robertson wrote, which was a document called Why Flats Fall Down. Yeah. Pretty brutal. Yeah. Particularly says, if you don't deal with this now, they will fall down. Yeah. Okay, they maybe won't. Well, the odd one might fall down. It happened in Miami. It nearly happened to tenement property of ours in Partick. But they will start to fall down. They will start to, and it's just going to hit the public purse. There's no question about that. Yeah. And I think, as well as I mentioned about MSP's mail bags bulging with complaints of the system, I think they're also recognising that local authority will be expected to step in and deal with this, which they do in limited circumstances, but they ain't got the resources. So it's going to fall back on them. So I would like to think that in the very short space of time, 5 or 6 years between now and 2030, that will be in place, and that will be the start of our journey over 5, 10, 15, 20 years to get these buildings into shape, to get the owners associations in place, whether it's a factor that becomes the manager for them, or whether I'm proved wrong and they are self-factored. That has to happen. And then a regime, which is a regime which is successfully pursued in many other countries and jurisdictions. Yeah. I regularly reference New South Wales and Australia and California and the USA that have had, obviously being in newer countries, they start from scratch and they put their homeowners association in at the start. Yeah. And it's just accepted practice that when you buy into a property, that there's a fund there already, that you continue to contribute to it. And if there isn't a fund, we don't buy the property. Yeah. Where at the moment in our situation, the question isn't asked, is there a fund? Because generally there isn't a fund. So I think it'll be in a good place. I think the industry will grow. I think there's opportunities through that. The Scottish Government have still got some ambitious targets for new housing, opportunities for those factoring firms that want to avail themselves to growing. I think there's plenty of space for that, and opportunities for people within it, people that may need to be replaced at some time. There's always a generation coming forward. I think it's a good place for people to start a career in. You mentioned the word hassle. Yes, that is a word that comes out a lot, and I know that you've spoken to others about the TPI, and one of the things they've been doing recently is researching how individuals in the industry are feeling, and are they going to hang around the industry or are they going to leave? And some of it doesn't make all that good reading. And I get that factoring isn't for everybody. You need to be pretty resilient and pretty thick-skinned. But despite the difficulties in the industry, in terms of customer interaction, if you can handle that, and if you can talk your way through that, and if you convince your client of the service that you're providing, and you want to make a career in the industry, I think it's a good place to be.
Okay, good. Thanks for that. Okay, I have one final question for you, and I'm actually quite looking forward to answer this. So, because we don't normally ask this anymore, actually. So, I know. We did early on in the when we started the podcast.
Has anybody ever asked you that question, Brian? Can I ask you that?
No, because I'm going to ask you first. Then you can ask me afterwards if you wish. So, and I'll give me time to think of it. Okay, tell us something about you that people are generally surprised to find out about you. And you're not allowed to mention football. No, you can mention football.
Since you've mentioned it, surprised, probably, did you use the word surprised or didn't know? Generally didn't know.
Generally surprised.
Surprised. Well, if yeah, and it does relate to football. Sorry, Brian. You knew it would. So I suppose you could argue that people that know me, that wouldn't come as a surprise that it was related to football, but the content of what I'm about to tell you would come as a surprise. I nearly left the industry in 2007, but only temporarily.
Okay.
What had happened was, and you've referenced football because you probably know that I have had a parallel, I'll call it career in football, from playing at a young age professionally and then moving into, despite at the age of 35 saying I've done my bit, I've served my time in football and I'll now go and do other things. I've got a family to raise, I'm going to maybe take up some other sport. I got a phone call and asked if I would take on the management of this football team. I just retired from playing, and of course I said no, and I said no again. At the third time I've asked, I said, okay, if you insist, I'll take it on for a year. So anyway, fast forward 5 years, I was still doing the job. Anyway, that continued for a number of years, and in parallel to being involved in business, I've had a parallel existence in professional sport and professional football, where I've played, coached, managed, been on the boards of football clubs over that period of time. So in 2007, the football club, the professional club that I was managing at the time, either through good fortune, good luck, good management, I don't know which, maybe a combination of them all, was doing particularly well, and I had been asked by a number of clubs to step up to a full-time level, none of which was of any great appeal to me.
Okay.
It maybe seems strange, because why, when you're in sport, do you not want to get to the top level? Because I was involved in professional football at a younger age, I still had and have a lot of friends in football, a lot of them still in management levels. And I remember one of them in particular saying to me a number of years ago, Neil, you got it spot on. The rest of us are getting a job for 6 months or 2 years and then getting sacked, and then we're looking for the next job. You've had this continuity of your own employment situation, and you've had the ability to enjoy your sport, albeit professional on a part-time basis. It's still pretty demanding. It's still training 3 nights a week and touring around the country overnight, Friday and Saturday, and with your wife and kids at home wondering, is he ever coming back? Will he ever give this up? So there was one, coming back to your question, there was one particular club in the Premiership that asked me to go and speak to them. And I thought, well, this is probably pretty major. I should at least go and talk to them.
Okay.
Just in case there was something I was missing. Is there something intriguing that this Premiership club would have that I just didn't see anywhere else? Why would you want to leave factoring? My goodness. So I went off to speak to them. I did say to my wife, I could be going for some time because I'm going to ask all the questions that I need answered. And I think at the end of that, I'm just going to say, well, thanks very much, but I'll stick with what I'm doing. And before I went for that meeting, I had a lengthy discussion with my business partner, and we agreed between us, getting back to my point about leaving the industry, I was going to take a 5-year sabbatical from the industry, which might have led to a full-time sabbatical, depending on where it went. So that is whether it's an interesting fact or a surprising fact. I almost left the industry. I went and chatted with the chairman and the chief exec of this football club, and they were obviously convinced that I was going to say yes because I was at a smaller part-time club. But they hadn't really looked into the background of me and what made me tick. So having spent 2 minutes thinking about it, I went back to them the next day and said, not for me. Do I regret it? No, I don't think so. Well, the proof is in the pudding because the person who they gave the job to, having had me turn it down, lasted 6 months and get sacked. So
you'd have been I could have been sabbatical, possibly.
I could have been,
or you could be there for 10 years. Yeah,
yeah. So anyway, I still stay involved in periphery football and enjoy it, obviously.
Good, thank you. Right, I'm not answering the question because I cannot follow that. So not a chance. You can. Why would we be so lame for following that? Neil, thank you very much for coming.
Welcome, Brian. Thanks for having me. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Good.
Let's do it again sometime.
We will. Maybe in 2030. See where we've got to.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.